Yeah, would you mind sharing a little bit about your background with the Urantia book and growing up in a Urantia book reader community and things?
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up, I was born in San Francisco, California, and lived there till I was 8. And then my parents moved us to Boulder, Colorado. Um, my dad found the Urantia book before I was born, and my mom read it to talk him out of it. And then had one of the great religious experiences of her life when she read it. So they moved us to Boulder in part to move us to a community of Urantia book readers, especially that had young kids. Um, and so I grew up in an environment where there were other families who were raising their kids with the teachings of the Urantia book from the time I was
Mhm.
8 years old until I went to college.
Could you talk a little bit about your experience? Then you eventually moved to New York and studied, became a playwright, I know, and wrote a play about Jesus, um, and then decided to go to Harvard Divinity School.
Yeah. Yeah.
Would you like to share a bit about that and what it was like being a Urantia book reader at Harvard Divinity School?
Sure. Yeah. So yes, I went to college in Providence, Rhode Island. I went to Brown, studied playwriting, and moved to Brooklyn when I was 22 and lived there for 6 years and worked in the arts, and then went to divinity school in 2013. And I went as so I went to Harvard Divinity School as a Master of Divinity candidate, which is a 3-year program. So I knew that I'd be there for 3 years if all went well. And I also knew that I would not have a job waiting for me on the other side. So I went to divinity school asking, how might I be of service in helping to deepen spiritual community in a time of religious change? So I was really studying trends in millennial disaffiliation and the rise of the spiritual but not religious, and how relationships to community and religious life were changing in America most.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, I was also very clear. Well, I should say, like, I had kind of come into my own adult relationship with the Urantia book when I was living in New York.
Mhm.
I think for a lot of people raised with the Urantia book, there comes an inflection point somewhere along the line where you kind of have to make your own call about this text and how much it matters to you and in what way. So without belaboring that story, like, I had come to a point where I believed the Urantia book was what it claimed to be. And that felt like a kind of injunction then on my life of about what I was going to do with those teachings in my own life. So anyway, it led me to decide that if I was going to go to Harvard Divinity School, I wanted to be completely transparent about the significance of the Urantia book to me, and also take it as an opportunity to share with others. And I didn't really have a sense of what the environment would be like and how familiar it would be, because Harvard Divinity School does pride itself on being kind of a bastion of world religions. But my experience was that pretty much no one had heard of it there either. Um, I had one friend in my class who had worked at a used bookstore in Utah, and he knew about it from the bookstore. And then I had one professor who I actually never studied with, Dan McCannon, but he studies new religious movements and he knew about it. So those were
Mhm.
the only two people I met in the 3 years at HDS who actually had heard of the Urantia book before they met me. So I tried to share it. So I used the Urantia book in a lot of my essays in class, and we had noon service was like this weekly worship service on campus that everyone was invited to. So I got really involved with that, and I hosted a couple of Urantia book services. One of them featured Pato Banton and Antoinette Hall. They came
Wow.
um, and performed.
Wow.
Yeah, and
Any of the faculty faculty express any interest or any kind of like, yeah, show any kind of interest in it?
Well, I remember after that service, there was a really delightful gentleman named Harry, who was the music director at HDS, who's now passed away. But I think he was really moved by that service. He really made a point to express how much he loved it and how much he thought that was what these services should be or should be about. So that stands out. Um, I did faculty wise, honestly, not much that I was aware of. I think the students were more interested. So I did start a study group at my house. And I had some students come pretty regularly for a while. And I think it was a combination, honestly, of the teachings of the book with just creating a welcoming environment,
Mm,
and a lot of folks being pretty lost or hungry spiritually. So it
mm,
wasn't just HDS students, like some of it was students from elsewhere at Harvard
mm.
would come, along
But
with,
yeah, it's just it's another more evidence of how even the people who are supposed to be experts on different movements and things, that it really tends to be under the radar.
yeah.
And a few people know very, very little about it. But yeah, it's quite interesting that way for a lot of different reasons. I mean, I guess in the first generations of readers, there was actually a policy of trying to not be public about it and things too, and asking people not to um, publish about it and things like that. So that might be part of the reason. But yeah, it's surprisingly unknown considering how many, well, like in the research I've been doing, how many famous people have been readers, even if in most cases they haven't been so public about it. And that's also interesting that um, maybe you could say a little bit more about the research that you've gone into, which you began at Harvard and you've been doing now, and how that's gotten a lot of media attention. And yeah, like New York Times and different National Geographic, I think you said, and a lot of different major publications have been very interested in it and covered it a lot. Um,
Yeah.
and then also how you came to discover through different foundations who have funded your research that a couple very influential people were Urantia book readers.
Yeah, so I kind of followed that thread of, asking where rising generations were finding spiritual community specifically,
Mhm.
and began researching that qualitatively. Like, I don't have a PhD or anything, right? It was all always kind of practitioner facing and very oriented by wanting to deepen community, wanting to foster spiritual growth. So I guess in that way, it has what divinity school students would call like a ministerial orientation. It was always
Mhm.
trying to put faith into practice for me, as opposed to just like have some objective view of what's going on. Anyway, so I really focused on my colleague Casper and I, who met at the beginning of grad school. We would always say we were telling stories of courage and hope. So we were always looking for examples of where people were finding meaning and connection and purpose and feeling really um, animated and
That which is analogous to what might be a synagogue previously or a church, but then could be in other forums.
yeah, exactly. It could be for sure.
Yeah, I remember you. The only one that I remember you talking about was CrossFit. That you had met the people who started it and interviewed them or something like that,
Yeah.
and that it
Yeah,
had similarities.
definitely. No, that it's CrossFit is remarkable and fascinating. Yeah. We did a lot of work with them. So yeah, so that it did get some media attention over the years. I mean, basically I've been writing about spiritual innovation is the language that's often used for it now, and talking about it in public, I guess, at this point for about 8 years.
Mhm.
Um, maybe, yeah, maybe 9. So it has become sort of I think the public association with me, to the extent that
Mhm.
there is one, which,
Yeah.
is a very niche thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there are a couple of foundations that have been the anchors of my life, basically, in terms of me having a job and having any sort of financial stability. And the most significant one is the Fetzer Institute and John Fetzer. So, this was definitely an answer to prayer because, as I said, I knew that I would not have a job waiting for me after I graduated. So I really had to create my own job, which I did. So Casper and I created a fellowship at Harvard. We became Ministry Innovation Fellows there, and we held that position for 5 years. So we basically got permission from the dean. He said, if you can get money, you can stay. So we reached out. Well, it's a longer story, but basically the Fetzer Institute agreed to that. But yeah, it was definitely a very memorable day when I went to the Fetzer Institute for the first time, and that's in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And they've changed some of the interior design, but at that time they had a library, a museum and library, which they still have some version of, but it's just different now. But at the time, the museum showcased a lot of John Fetzer's favorite spiritual texts, and he was a real spiritual maverick. He read everything. He was really interested in like our capacity to communicate with the dead. He made his millions in radio, and he got into radio because he was trying to communicate with his dead mother. So like he had a real, just nothing was off limits in terms of his curiosity. Yeah, so like lo and behold, there in that museum was just a Urantia book. And this was coming on the heels of my first in-person meeting with Michelle Scheit, who's now been our program officer for years and is an extraordinary person. And we had breakfast together, and I was finally sharing some of my own personal spiritual background, and she was as well. So I did the usual, like I grew up with this book called the Urantia book. Nobody's heard of it. And she goes, "Oh, John Fetzer was a Urantia book reader," and I just like could have fallen out of my chair. It was so crazy. But yeah, the foundation's mission is to help build the spiritual foundations for a loving world. So it's this
Wow.
incredibly overt spiritual mission without any affiliation to a religious tradition. So um, I give thanks every day for John Fetzer and for the vision that he cast and for the consecration of his resources for this purpose. Yeah.
It, yeah, I read that his foundation is value, or, has the resources of like $500 million. And
I'm sure it's more than that now. It was
wow,
500 million like
that was years ago. Yeah, but and that yeah, and that it maybe it was her, but somebody who knew about him from his foundation said that he read it very methodically. That it was one of his prized texts, which he read very methodically.
yeah, that I don't know for sure. I mean, I
Mhm.
certainly know it was its prominence in the museum at the time suggests that it was one of them.
Yeah. Yeah, there were
Um,
just a few that were like out on a table that I saw the picture. Um,
yeah, I mean, at at the moment, if you go into the retreat center, and I was just there last week, every room of the retreat center has a little sort of pithy, I think it's an excerpt from A Course in Miracles in it.
mm,
So, yeah, I think what I don't want to suggest is that in some way the Urantia book was like his sole
right,
reference. It definitely
right.
was not. He was,
Yeah, but it was they yeah, someone at his foundation confirmed that it was one of the ones that he really studied. Uh,
yes, I think he definitely studied it. Yes, I
yeah.
do get that sense.
Um, yeah, and then lo and behold, you stumbled on another person who was he also somehow involved with your research or with funding your research, Templeton.
Yeah, yeah. So John Templeton I mean, financially was even more successful than John Fetzer, um, and started the Templeton Fund. And he started 3 foundations, and he was such a capitalist that he basically like set them up to compete with each other. And so we currently have funding from the Templeton World Charity Foundation, but there are 2 others that do overlapping yet slightly different work. But yeah, John Templeton was another one of these really, pretty remarkable, like spiritual seeker and also spiritual thinker, I guess.
Mhm.
And so he wrote quite a bit about um, his understanding of spirituality and the significance of it, and he was a real believer in the possibility of new spiritual knowledge. So I think he was particularly kind of flummoxed and frustrated by why we poured so many resources into these other areas to advance
Mhm.
our understanding, and he felt like
Mhm.
there was a big gap. And so yeah, as I think I talked to you about it at the time. I must have been like researching for a grant proposal. I think we had been invited to propose, and there's of course a section that's about the relationship of your grant to Sir John's donor intent. And I
Mhm.
think it was in that context that I was researching some of his work. And yeah, so there was a text that I came upon that really was trying to synthesize truths from different traditions. And
Mhm.
that was the one that had references, overt references to the Urantia book. I don't have a personal connection
Copy.
in the
Yeah.
way that I did at Fetzer to
Yeah.
understand more about his knowledge of the Urantia book and how deeply he
Mhm.
studied it. But he was certainly aware of it and citing it in at least one of
Yeah.
his. So
Yeah. And that's also kind of it's possible that when he did so, that he would have been told by the foundation that he didn't have permission, but a lot of times people maybe didn't know to ask or would have done so. Yeah, I mean, he could have afforded lawyers if they had wanted to sue him, but that just kind of adds to it is quite unique, quite unusual that people had published, had cited or quoted the Urantia book in their publications,
mm,
and
mm,
it's, it's quite also to think that probably between him and John Fetzer, there's probably or there's probably they might be the biggest examples of like these huge philanthropists who have been funding this type of research, who have been trying to support spiritual growth and things like that in a more universal sense, not associated just with the Catholic Church or whatever
yeah,
it might be. And
exactly.
that
Yeah,
they both
very
definitely read the Urantia book to whatever extent. Maybe Templeton, we don't. It'll probably just always be left up to the imagination. But yeah, I read that he was the maybe one of the most generous philanthropists in history, and that he was also very focused on his own spiritual life, um, which he attributed to some of his success to his ability to um, avoid anxiety and um, keep an elevated mood and things like this. Considered the greatest stock picker of the century, you know, at least been called that.
right.
But yeah, what a interesting, and it's like I've been researching famous people who have read the Urantia book for decades now, and then that it just shows that there's still these examples that don't show up on people's radar. That I mean, there's
Right.
hundreds of Urantia books readers out there who, if they had known about these examples, they probably would have told me. So it's between my own research and then also there's all these other readers who, when they notice something, will pass the information on to me, and
Right.
it's quite interesting, coincidence, or that if you hadn't stumbled on this, we would have never known that these two extremely successful and influential people, read the Urantia book, and it's fun to imagine in what way, to what extent it might have influenced them.
Totally. Yeah, totally. And I think you're absolutely right. It is very unusual to have foundations that have an overt spiritual orientation without a religious foundation, or, that they're not
With a
rooted in.
dogma or being
Yeah,
locked to a
yeah,
certain, yeah,
yeah. And so it does, um, yeah, it does kind of stand to reason in some sense.
yeah. It's so fun. So fun to get to chat with you. Is there any, I suppose we should probably, I mean, I know we should probably say goodbye here soon, but is there anything else you might want to say about your own, maybe about the Progress Project that you've been, one of your initiatives that you've been doing to help your Angie book readers with their spiritual growth? Or also maybe if you want to mention anything about anything else about your research or anything like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I am inspired by people who have taken the teachings of the Urantia book and applied them both in their own personal lives to foster their own spiritual growth, and then also in how they live and how they serve, right? So that's definitely my aspiration, and it's the motive for the work that I do, but it's also why it feels my own spiritual growth feels inextricable from the work itself, or in some way is part of the work itself. So that has led me to create a lot of things that are oriented around fostering spiritual growth. So one of them is the Progress Project, which has been, I guess, like 7 or 8 years now in the making, of just trying to support personal spiritual progress in community. And Liz Craig and May Thompson and I started it, I think, 8 years ago. And then April Helen has been a big part of turning it into a course at Urantia University and helping to grow that community, which has been really meaningful. And I know you have been journeying alongside us, and have been through that course and everything. So that's been really great. And yeah, just the work that I am doing now is really oriented toward trying to support the field of spiritual innovation and
Mm.
help to orient it around and toward love. Um, and so love as basically an operating principle internally and relationally and in society. And so, yeah, I'm right in the midst of doing a lot to try to orchestrate and guide a number of different organizations that are all supporting spiritual innovators around the
Mhm.
US and some of them globally. So it's an exciting time, and I don't know what's going to happen, but I'll keep at it. And
Wow, it sounds exciting. It's hard to imagine the details of it, but I'll have to hear more about it sometime. It sounds really interesting. And I
yeah,
suppose with the Progress Project, what's a bit new in a sense about it is that it's like a complement that the Urantia movement for a long time, the standard was to have study groups where people have intellectual discussions about the Urantia book and read the Urantia book together. And they would develop the friendships and everything, but there wasn't really community focused on the personal spiritual growth. Whereas the Progress Project kind of tries to be, or the aim is to regularly check in with a small group of people, triad, a group of three, and pray together, talk about spiritual goals and things like that, and support each other in achieving spiritual goals. So it's uh, it's like a good complement to the very intellectual focus that the Urantia movement historically has had.
that's the
Um,
idea. Yeah.
yeah,
That's good description. Yes, exactly. That was a big part of what led us to start it, and yeah, hopefully some of the value that it adds.
yeah. Well, have a great day, Angie. It's so good to see you. I hope we can
Thanks.
talk again soon.
Yeah.